Good evening. Today I'll be giving a review and answering some questions about the play Intimate Apparel by Lynn Nottage. First off, I would like to give a rating about this play and compare it to some of the other OIB works in the OIB curriculum. I would give a poor rating of 5.5 to this play for the following reasons. First of all, I really didn't enjoy the plot of the story. I believe the plot was extremely monotonous and wasn't very interesting for my taste. Second, I did not enjoy reading this work because I had a hard time identifying myself with the protagonists, which is one thing that I love about literature. Third, and in comparison to the other OIB works, this work is relatively poor in the use of language. I found nearly no motifs, symbols, or themes that characterize the play, elucidating the global meaning of the play. I simply could not paint a larger picture for this work. While watching the YouTube video of the Westport Playhouse, I found Mark Lamos, the artistic director of Intimate Apparel, discussion of the play very interesting. Lamos alludes to this typical aspect of common life. He makes us imagine someone who is waiting at the subway, reading a book, and that while hearing others talk, stops reading his book and begins listening to their conversation. While listening to this conversation, the person waiting at the subway is able to identify with the content of the conversation. Lamos refers to the story to show that we are all related, meaning that we all have the same hopes, the same dreams, and the same lack of confidence, which is striking in Intimate Apparel. I found this very interesting because while reading the play, I was able to identify, on different scales of course, to the sentiments of the characters of the play, as well as the numerous life-changing decisions the characters were forced to take. For example, I identify to first Esther's reluctance to give George her life savings, seen with, quote, "No, that half my life," and then her decision of giving it to George, seen with there, there, there. At numerous occasions, I have been faced with situations where I was able to make a difficult choice on such a short deadline, which is how I identified to this situation involving Esther. I will now be discussing the significance of one of the motifs in the play. I found that the motif of lingerie and fabric was extremely significant in the play. I believe this motif is important because it alludes to the title of the work as a whole, Intimate Apparel. In fact, the fabric and lingerie appears each time Esther goes to Mr. Marks to buy fabric. Through the medium of fabric, Esther and Mr. Marks are able to share a common bond of intimacy. They share this tie of intimacy through their common knowledge and interest of fabric. Finally, the motif of fabric and lingerie ties the relationship between Esther and Mr. Marks by the fact that Mr. Marks puts pieces of fabric on the side just for Esther, seen with these two quotations. Come in, I have a number of things to show you. And the second quotation, feel this one, Japanese silk, your special order for the lady on the Fifth Avenue. It took me nearly 1 month to find this very piece. I'll answer 5 questions. The first question is, how do the dreams of the characters affect the choices they make in the play and the relationships each character has to one another? Throughout the play, a number of characters have dreams, causing tensions in the relationships of the characters. The best examples to take is the relationship between Esther Mills and George Armstrong. Esther dreams of, quote, a beauty parlor, while dreams of, quote, I want to build things, and buying a dozen horses. George more specifically wants to spend Esther's life savings to buy a stable containing 12 horses in order to work for his own account. The two contrasting dreams of the two characters ultimately cause tensions in the relationships, accompanied, of course, by the fact that George is seeing Miami secretly, and ultimately cause the relationship to fall apart. I will move on to the next question. Although at the beginning of the play, Esther appears level-headed, soon she embarks on a daring romance by correspondence. In Scene 5, Mrs. Dickinson say of the man she's writing to, he'll steal your common sense, he will, and walk away. It just don't seem like you. Esther, you're too practical of girl for this. So why does Esther go against the advice of her landlady and continue her letters to George? In the play, Esther goes against the advice of Mrs. Dickinson and continues writing letters to George. I believe Esther disregards the advice of her landlady because these letters have made Esther feel for the first time sentiments of intimacy and love for another character and another person, seen with the quotation, quote, "And I give this quilt and everything in it to be with someone I care for." Additionally, Esther is a young woman of 35. She desperately wants to find a husband and love, and therefore, seeing this opportunity with George, she would like to continue writing the letters. The second question of question number 4: what others female characters give up their common sense in order to chase a dream? In the play, Mrs. Van Buren is another female character who gives up their common sense to chase a dream. Seeking emotional happiness and intimacy with another character, Mrs. Van Buren desperately attempts to bond with her husband, who is frustrated by the fact that they can't conceive a child. Third question I will answer is, another character Esther spends time with is Mrs. Van Buren. What is the nature of their relationship, what brings them together, and what keeps them apart? In the play, the protagonist, Esther Mills, spends a great amount of time with Mrs. Van Buren. Mrs. Van Buren is a rich, quote, attractive white woman in her late 30s and who lives on Fifth Avenue. Esther supplies and fabrics a lot of lingerie for Mrs. Van Buren. I believe that the thing that brings Esther and Mrs. Van Buren together is the fact that their romantic relationship parallel. Just as Esther is miserable in the fact that she can't find the right husband, Mrs. Van Buren cannot find emotional happiness and feels isolated from her husband as the couple struggle to conceive a child. What differentiates the two characters is the fact that Mrs. Van Buren once shared a link of intimacy with her husband, while Esther never really has shared a link of intimacy. The fourth question: examine the letters George sends to Esther. What character of the letter writer are suggested through the things the letter writer says and the way he says them? How is George's character different than the portrait conveyed through these letters? In George's letters, George appears to be a loving, friendly, and committed man. Through the use of effective language, seen with expressions such as, "all this wonder and waste, but your letter be the most splendid thing and shall ride in me pocket until the next," or "the colors that you find pleasing," George is able to appear as this warm, affectionate character and completely deceive Esther of his true character. The description in Act 2, Scene 2 of George's and Esther's first night together, however, completely rejects and counters the portrait drawn of George in his letters. In this scene, George appears to be in the relationship only for sexual matters and seems to disregard the feelings of Esther. And finally, the last question. Throughout the play, the audience knows that Esther is deceiving George, having others write her letters for her. Why does the playwright wait until the end of the play to reveal that George's letters have been deceptive as well? If Nottage made it clear that George isn't the man in his letters right from the start, how would this change the perception of the way he treats Esther once they meet and marry? I believe Nottage waited until the end of the play to reveal that George's letters had not actually been written by George himself, to create an effect of surprise as well as to shock the spectators in his or her expectations. If Nottage had made it clear that George hadn't wrote the letters, I believe the play wouldn't have been as interesting and compelling. Through this long wait, Nottage is able to create some sort of expectations on the behalf of the spectator, and the fact that he completely destroys these expectations allows him to deliver a powerful message. This can be more clearly seen with Esther's reaction to Miami's words, putting forth involuntarily, indirectly, and unknowingly that she is sleeping with George. Her words, "I pity your heart, you're the worst sort of scavenger," manifest the exact same reaction of the reader who believed in George's and Esther's relationship and saw it grow once he sees that George is actually secretly sleeping with Miami. Thanks for watching the video, and I hope I gave a thorough review and I answered some of the main questions about intimate apparel.